Welcome to our webinar on the built environment on records relating to the New South Wales State Architect in the State Archives collection. First, our acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, New South Wales State Archives acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal people today. So where I wanted to start today was just to make that differentiation between government buildings and private buildings. So we do draw this line in the State Archives collection, and it will just be helpful for you to understand the context of what I'm talking about today. So government buildings, the government is involved in government buildings in terms of their planning and design work, the construction and maintenance of those buildings, and the alterations to those buildings, as well as sometimes furnishing those buildings as well. And then we draw that line to private buildings where the government doesn't usually build those buildings, but it is involved perhaps in safety and fire inspections, valuing the property and valuing the improvements to that property, such as the houses, the other kinds of structures, the fencing and so on. There might be regulation in terms of how tall a building is or what kind of structure can be placed on a particular piece of land, and also urban planning. So today we're really looking at government buildings and the records that we hold in the State Archives collection related to government buildings. So when we think about government buildings, we're thinking about the structures like courthouses, jails, asylums, police stations, hospitals, schools, wharves, railway stations and other buildings owned by the railway department, bridges, roads even would also be structures that are constructed by the government, although we're not talking about roads today. And two other categories would be post offices and lighthouses. So in the 19th century, the New South Wales Colonial government did construct these buildings and keep records about them, but the control of those buildings went to the Commonwealth government on Federation in 1901. So the records that we hold to do with both post offices and lighthouses are fairly limited, although you do see bits and pieces of those throughout our collection at New South Wales State Archives. Now, when you're thinking about researching government buildings in the State Archives collection, as with all research, so whether it's family history, local history, or other kinds of work, the first thing to do is some homework. So we also do homework before we go looking for material in the collection, just to get a little bit of context and a baseline about what we're actually looking for. So we might do a literature search. In terms of government buildings, the New South Wales State Heritage Register is a very useful place to go looking, and as is the Heritage New South Wales online catalogue. And on the catalogue there you can find digital copies of reports and files, conservation management plans and other publications. And these are often very well researched. There's lots of references to the historical changes over time, and so these can help you when you're searching for things in the State Archives collection. And of course other published sources such as books. So one particular book that comes to mind for us is a book by James Semple Kerr called Design for Convicts, an account of design for convicts establishments in the Australian colonies during the transportation era. So do your homework before you come looking in the State Archives collection. Now, next you might want to go to our website. So our website is records.nsw.gov.au, and there's a couple of key links on our homepage, which you can see here, which are quite useful when you're doing any kind of research. So in our quick links, we've got links to our online indexes and our Research A to Z, which is like a subject guide of material in the collection, as well as our webinars. You can see there a link to our webinar library. And then the big search box that you can see underneath the picture of the Harbour Bridge there, that's a link to our catalogue. So if you put a search term in there and hit the big search button, that will allow you to search the catalogue for material. So when we search the catalogue, You might try a search for a public building just by using the name of the building and the building type. So Dubbo Jail, Broken Hill Telegraph Office, Supreme Court, Sydney, Callan Park Hospital, those kinds of things. And you can come up with quite a bit of records that way. Here I've done a search for Dubbo Jail just to give you an idea of what you might be able to see. So on the screen on the left-hand side there, we can see we've got a lot of plans listed in this particular view. And on the right-hand side there, there's a lot of information about the kinds of records that Dubbo Jail is showing up in the series of. So we've got Aperture cards of plans for Dubbo Jail. We've got plans of public buildings, include Dubbo Jail. We've got building and construction and maintenance files, Dubbo Jail. And we've also got photographic description books for Dubbo Jail. So a lot of our records, because it was a functioning jail at one stage, and we do have records of that time, we do have records of the inmates who were at that jail. And so a lot of those have been digitised and are up on our website. You could also do a search by function or activity, I should say. So the government has particular functions, and these are broken up into various activities. So these are things that the government does as part of its work. And one of the things that the government does is building construction and maintenance, and another one is building design. And so we've tried to categorise all of the different activities that the government does and then link records back to those activities. So building construction and maintenance, if we clicked on that link, for example, and here's some more if we search for construction. So we've got building construction and maintenance, railway and tramway construction, and road and bridge construction and maintenance. If we clicked on one of those activity links and I clicked on building construction and maintenance, it will give you a little bit of an overview of what that activity entailed and the history of it. So when did we begin as a government to start doing building construction and maintenance? So in 1832, it became a distinct colonial government activity with the creation of the Office of the Colonial Architect. So that's a useful piece of information to know. It's no point looking for colonial architect records before 1832 because there wasn't a colonial architect. It does say that the government did do such activity before 1832, but it wasn't really an official activity until 1832. And then I've drawn a circle to our link to see all series, and that's where you'll find a list of all the series that we hold in the collection related to building, construction and maintenance. So that can be another useful way to approach these records. And here you've got that list where you can see all of those building and construction records, well, 10 of them at least. So a range of different things from different agencies and different series there. Everything from the Opera House to photographs of buildings in Sydney to a plan of store offered for sale as a courthouse in Gundagai. So all kinds of things show up in those lists there. And you could filter that further by particular agencies. So you could go to see what was created by the fire brigades in terms of building and construction and maintenance, or the Premier's Department, or Government Architect, or Department of Lands, for example. So some of the main agencies involved in government buildings were, as we said, the Colonial Architect, who was created in 1832 and carried out that role as a separate office until 1890. The Department of Public Works was established in 1856. And then in 1890, the Colonial Architect became an office, if you like, or a branch of the Public Works Office Department. The Department of Education's Architects branch was established in 1880 and ran to 1904. In 1904, that branch was also transferred to Public Works. And then in 1912, it was transferred back to education and continued to look after some of those large-scale school and education building projects. The Railway and Tramways Department was established in the 1850s, and then from 1917, the railway and tramway construction branch, or later the Ways and Works branch, really looked after all of the aspects of railway construction within the Railways Department. So chopping and changing over the years, but Public Works, Government Architects branch, and we still have the Government Architects Office today, and it still looks after government buildings. Now, there are some things to consider when you're thinking about accessing building records that are created by the New South Wales State Government. So there are access directions. So generally, records are accessible once they turn 30. So once a record turns 30, it can be considered to be open to public access. However, agencies have the right to close records for longer periods of time if they think that there might be a security issue or sensitive personal information may also be included in some records. In this instance, we're probably thinking more about security buildings and security structures, and those kinds of records that are security buildings, the records of those are closed for a longer period of time than 30 years. Public Works have got those records closed whilst the buildings are current. And if we're thinking of security buildings, you might think of police stations, courthouses, and jails and Parliament House, for example. And all other records open to public access after 30 years. So places like schools and hospitals, those sorts of things, open after 30 years. Education, building and property records are open to public access after 30 years. And jail records created by corrective services closed for 70 years from the date of closure of the complex. So if a jail closes tomorrow, the records to do with the design and construction of that jail won't be open for another 70 years after that jail has closed. And a lot of agencies close plans of current buildings and services while those plans are still current. So for example, local council records of their local council building would be closed as long as that building is operating as a local council building, for example. So the kinds of records that we hold in the collection about public buildings are things like files and plans and photographs. What you see in this image here is the Department of Education records room, and we see some staff working on records in that record room. So just to give you a bit of a feel for how these records might have lived when they were first created there. So early in the colony, so we know that before 1832 there wasn't really an official government architect as such, but construction and planning and repair of public buildings was undertaken by individuals. So think of people like Francis Greenway, Standish Harris, William Cox is another one that comes to mind. And where you might look for records for those early constructions might be the Colonial Secretary's papers. So the early papers, 1788 to 1825, you could look for the name of the building or the project. You could look for the names of those who were involved in the construction of that building, which you might know if you've done some homework already. Or you might also look for the locality. So I might look for Windsor if I'm looking for records about the jail or the courthouse or the lockup or something there. After 1826, you might look in the Colonial Secretary's Index to Main series of letters received. And we have some bundles of correspondence, particularly in that 1828 to 49 period, where they're arranged by subject. And you can search for bundles of correspondence from the colonial architect or bundles of correspondence between 1828 and 32 about public buildings in New South Wales, and they might be quite informative. We also have the index to the Colonial Secretary's papers 1826 to 1896, which might also contain information about a locality, people involved in construction, or the buildings themselves on occasion. So the early colonial secretaries' papers, 1788 to 1825, have been indexed, and you can see digital copies of those papers in our catalogue. And this is where I got this image, or these two images, from. So this is a letter from William Cox Sr., which contained a plan and specifications for the new Windsor Jail, and it was dated 1819. So I have it on authority that this is actually not too bad a plan for the time period of which it was created. And the references on the right there, I've actually done a little transcription of, so you can read it a bit more clearly. So it specifies the thickness of the walls, the thickness of the outer cell walls, how far apart the nails were to be, and the height of the building. So if you knew the height of the old ones, also very helpful to know that too. But you can see that there is that correspondence and this very lovely, quite clear plan from that early time period there. From 1832 onwards, we might be more interested in the records of the colonial architect itself. So this is the office that was created to deal with the construction, maintenance, alteration, furnishing of public buildings. So dealt with the plannings and specifications, dealt with the repair, superintendence of all the works executed by contract. And then from 1844, roads, bridges, wharves and quays also came under the purview of the colonial architect. From 1848, military works and buildings. 1856, public works was created, and I should say 1890 that the colonial architect moved over to public works. And then they also got the job of designing and constructing large school buildings from education in 1896. So we do have a guide in our Research A to Z on the colonial architect's records, and we also have an index to the early records. If you go to our indexes online and go to building and construction, you'll see that there is a colonial architect index there, and this is to our early records. This index includes these early records of files for the erection, repair, alterations and additions to public buildings, 1837 to 1912. So they're really early files. We've got some early designs from 1837. There's some early plans, of which you see there the custom station at Botany is an example. So these early plans, there's about 3,500 early plans, and we've digitised 438 of those, and you can see those in the catalogue. We've got plans and specifications of school residences, 1861 to 1910, and also some photographs of war memorials in New South Wales after the First World War, which have been digitised. So if one went to search the Colonial Architect Index, it would look a bit like this. So I've done a search on Callan Park as an example here, and you can see we've got details of records in that index that have the word Callan Park in them. What I've picked up here are plans mainly. So we've got various plans of the hospital. I can see the plan numbers in the citation column. I can see a description. I can see the date of the plan. So a lot of them are quite early in terms of the hospital's history, 1877, 1881. And then I can see a details link on the right-hand side of the screen. So if I click on that, I will go to our catalogue and I'll see that same index entry in its entirety in our catalogue. What I'm also doing is I'm making a note of the plan number, the plan 1056, and also the Colonial Architect plan number, MH2/680. So I've made a note of both of those. I'm just going to put those aside for a second. Now, just to talk a little bit about plans in more detail. So we do hold these plans of public buildings from 1834 to 1970, indexed, as I said, in the Government Architects Index. Plans, elevations, sections and details of public buildings such as police stations, courthouses, jails, government offices and schools. Here we've got another beautiful example of the Mint, and that's the front elevation of the Mint. Some of these are digitised, as we said before, 438 out of 3,470 digitised, and you'll find these in the catalogue. So we've already looked in the catalogue to see an entry from the index as an index entry, but I can also search for that item in our catalogue as an item. So they're quite different things, an index entry and an item. So if I search for that same plan that we just looked at the index for, this MH2/680, if I go and look at that in our catalogue that way, I can see here I can pick up some digital copies of plans. And the second option there is our MH2/680. So to find that in my particular search, I just did a general search, Callan Park, filtered to digitally available, and then filtered to the series plans of public buildings. Another thing I could have done is just put MH2/680 into the search box, and that would have picked it up as well, but I would have missed all the other plans there. Or I could have gone Callan Park plan, perhaps, to come up with something there that way as well. So anyway, however you've come across it, we can then view that plan in the catalogue like so, and there's the digital copy of the plan. We also have a large number of photographs from agencies such as the Government Printing Office and the Maritime Services Board. And here is a photograph of Callan Park Hospital towards the end of construction. So this is about 1883, a few years after the plan was drawn. So it's just nice to see that different view and actually see the hospital as it was when it was actually constructed in 3D, if you like. Another example might be this plan of the Broken Hill Post Office. So I said that most of the post office records do go off to the Commonwealth Government after Federation in 1901, but we do have some bits and pieces about these structures in our collection, and this plan is one of those. So here this is actually the post office having the telegraph office attached to it. So you can see the post office there and it's black and white, and then the telegraph office and the plans for that and how it was all going to fit together. And here we have a beautiful photograph of the post office from Broken Hill. And I'm always struck by just how well dressed people in Broken Hill were back at this time that the photograph was taken. It looks very genteel. We also have files concerning the erection, repair, additions and alterations to public buildings. These are also indexed in the Colonial Architects Index. So this would be the paperwork to do with those early government buildings. So it's things like letters, reports, memos, plans and specifications, printed reports and returns about all these different kinds of public buildings, and includes material about preparing designs and plans, selecting sites, preparing specifications and contracts, the tenders, the awarding of the contracts, the inspection of the construction work, the accounts, the equipment, the furniture, the custody of the building, the repair and the maintenance. So if you're researching an early building, this series is really useful. And because most of the records relate to specific buildings, you can do a search for a particular building and see if there's something there. These files, which vary in size quite greatly, they're not digitised, so you would have to come to our reading room to look at them. You can pre-order them before you come in, but you would need a physical visit or to send someone else for a physical visit to view these records. The image there at the side is a list of the furniture in the Government House at Sydney in July 1846. So this is when they moved from the old Government House to the new Government House, and the old building had fallen into disrepair, but they did create a list of the furniture, and there's a lot of material about the building of the next Government House in the collection. Another search might be, as an example, Customs House. So here I've just done a general search on Customs House in the Government Architects Index there. And you can see this time I've picked up a lot of different correspondence. And if you look at the place column, we've also got quite a few customs houses around New South Wales. So Newcastle, Sydney, Ballina, Brisbane, Albury, which makes sense because they're all around the edges of the colony. So customs between colonial areas, but also customs to overseas with the Sydney and the Newcastle, for example. So if I click on my details screen there, I'll get a link across to our catalogue where I see much the same information as what I saw in the index. This is an index entry, and I can request a copy of that file to view in the reading room if I go to the side of our catalogue to fill in the details about that item as an item not in catalogue. It's an index item, but the file itself is not listed individually in a way that we can request it. So I have to add information about this file, so the 2/579, the series 4332, and that it's Customs House Sydney. I can also see the date there, 1845 to 66, and I might include that information in my request to view that in the reading room. So what would I look at if I actually requested that item? So this is actually a bound volume. Some of these records are bound into volumes and some of them are just piles of documents wrapped in brown paper, if you like. But this particular one, which includes Customs House, is a bound volume. What we're looking at here is Customs House, which was designed by Mortimer Lewis and built in 1845. And there were a couple of new wings added later in 1883 and 1889. And it was also expanded to 3 levels from 2 in 1887. So the Customs Service was responsible for imports, exports, excise on locally manufactured goods, immigration control, control of narcotics and morally corrupt goods such as books and films. So what we see here is a tender by Francis Callaghan for the construction of accommodation for the boat's crew, the completing of the wall, etc. at Customs House in Sydney, and it's dated in 1847. And the photograph down the bottom is just a picture of Government House as it was, Customs House at Circular Quay as it was prior to receiving that third story there. And these are a couple of other documents to do with Customs House. So there's a list of additions on the left-hand side there from 1862. So you'll see a list of the labourers required, the type of work that they were doing, how long they were doing it for, and the equipment and material that they needed. So if you were interested in the fabric of Customs House, this kind of document might be very useful in terms of what they actually did to the building back in 1862. And on the right, what you see is a letter also from 1862. So it's talking about the new quarters that were built for the housekeeper there, and she wanted a cooking stove to be installed. She's included, or the customs officer who wrote, the collector of customs who wrote the letter includes a picture of the stove, which is that little black thing that didn't photograph too well, I'm sorry. But he points out that some of the officers of the department were occasionally detained at Customs House at unreasonable hours, and they were obliged to obtain refreshment from the housekeeper. So he was endorsing her application as a proper one. So he's felt that the stove was definitely required for the office there. We also hold later files from the Government Architect, which are not listed in that index, but are listed in our catalogue. So the 3 big series that come to mind here are our B files, the Building, Construction and Maintenance files of the 20th century, the SB and the S files, which are school and tertiary education building files, and the H files, which are the health buildings. All 3 series fully listed in the catalogue, and they contain really architectural and engineering matters for those government agency buildings. So these are quite an amazing series of records as well. So all the files are listed in the catalogue, as I just said. You must think about access directions when you're searching these files. So files concerning security buildings are closed to public access while the building is current. So anything to do with a police station or a courthouse that is still running as a police station or a courthouse, for example, would still be closed to public access, or a jail or a juvenile justice centre or anything like that closed to public access. But other records to do with schools, or I can see there the domestic water supply of Western Plains Zoo, for example, that would be open to public access. And these are architectural and engineering matters relating to the construction and maintenance of buildings for New South Wales agencies. And there's also other records that we have for electrical and mechanical engineering services provided by the Engineering Department of Public Works. And as we just said before, there was a separate SB for school records registry and an H register for hospital and health buildings. But the B system did continue to include schools and hospital files as well. So I think to find things here, I'd be searching for a particular building or structure to see what we have, and then maybe filtered down to a particular series using the Tweak My Results column there on the right-hand side of the search screen. So on your left here, we've got an actual box. This is what confronts you when you pull a file that's a B file. They look like this. So they're very 20th century files there. And the file that I've pulled out of the box is the Jindabyne Trout Hatchery on Thredbo River. This file particularly dates to 1948 to 1968 and gives us a lot of information about the trout hatchery. So we've got information right from the very earliest times, so it can give you a little bit of history sometimes. So this one talks about the volunteers that set up the trout hatchery and runs through the government taking it over in the 1950s, and also includes some plans of buildings that were on the site there. And so that's what you see on the right-hand side is one of the plans out of that file, and they're just folded up and included in the file. And then right down the bottom is a photograph from the Trout Hatchery's website today. So this one's, the hatchery's operated since 1953 on the banks of the Thredbo River. The land was donated by William Napthali, and much of the construction work of the hatchery was undertaken by volunteers at the time. It was operated by the Monaro Acclimatisation Society on a voluntary basis until it was overtaken by New South Wales Fishery. And these days, over 1 million fish are grown annually for recreational fishing. So I found that information through the file, but also doing a little bit of background homework, looking on the hatchery's website itself. But everything checked out, so it was really cool. These are our favourite records. These are the Aperture cards that were plans relating to public works projects dating 1803 to 2008. So these are microfilm copies of plans that were projects proposed or conducted by public works. Most of the original plans, we understand, were destroyed after microfilming, but some were transferred to New South Wales State Archives. So those earlier plans we looked at, some of those would be the originals of these microfilms. There are over 645,000 plans, which are all listed in the catalogue. So if you search for a building structure, chances are a lot of what you'll find would be something from NRS 21554, which will bring you back one of these little Aperture cards. So they're sketches, working drawings, executed plans in a variety of categories, including architectural, engineering, mechanical, electrical, structural, hydraulic, and survey, and all kinds of government buildings, facilities, and precincts. And you can see a list of all of those different kinds of structures listed there on the overhead. So if I come into the reading room to view one of those, you'll need to put it onto a machine like this one, which is a microfilm reader, and this links up to a computer screen. And this is what you get. So I just downloaded this off the screen, just in its entirety, but you can actually zoom into various bits and pieces of the plan if that's what you want to do. And this example is the Mitchell Library. It's the basement, first floor, ground and first floor plans and elevations from 1926 of the Mitchell Library there. And here we have another plan from 1957, which is more of an internal plan of the Dixon Wing from 1957. So these are black and white, as you can see. They were copied in black and white, so only viewable in black and white. Now, we also hold records of school buildings. So from the Department of Education, which did design and build its own buildings for quite a period of time. Sometimes Public Works Office did it and then government architects, but it was also a function that education took back. So there are a lot of site records and school files and other sorts of records to do with buildings that were created by Department of Education that have come to us from education. So the site register cards, so there's one card for each school site listed, sort of talking about the land titling history, and you might get a little portion plan showing you the footprint of the school buildings and that kind of thing, when it was, if it was sold, dates that it was sold, all of that sort of information is there. We also have school files, and these date from 1876 to 1979, and they're correspondence kept by the Department of Education about individual schools. So arranged by the name of the school, Eugowra School, Gundagai School, Orange Public School, Orange East Public School, Fort Street Public School, whatever the name of the school was. And you'll see correspondence about teachers and kids and the community, but also a lot of material about the selection of a school site and the buildings of various buildings on that school site would all be in the school files there. We also have the Department of Education photographic collection. So this was photographs that the histories unit of the Department of Education collected over a long period of time, and they transferred these to us. So we've digitized a lot of the photographs, and you can see one example there, and this is from Urundari Public School, which is where Henry Lawson went to school. And we've digitized the pre-1955 photographs. We also have some plans of public buildings that include schools, and these would be listed in the Government Architect's Office. And then we have the SB and the S files listed in our catalogue from the Government Architect as well. So there's a wide range of sources you can go to find records about public buildings. So here we have a plan from Linburn School at the Kuyal diggings. You can see that the schoolhouse is there with the teachers' residence on the side and the plan of the residence there. So definitely living where you work in this case. This is dated 1882, 1883. And in the school files, we also have correspondence about the school buildings. So there's, here we see a tender for the teachers' residence in 1882. And there is later correspondence about this school. So in 1902, we've got a group of letters about the inspection of the teachers' residence because it had fallen into somewhat bad repair, I suppose you would say. There was an infestation of bugs, and it was felt to just not be habitable by the teacher and the family who was to live there at the time. So there's a lot of toing and froing about who was to clean the property and to remove the bugs and do all of that sort of stuff. And then by 1933, we have a letter from the inspector to the Department of Education, the manager to the Department of Education there, saying that the teacher's residence had been rented out to a member of the public, Mr. Benson, and he'd been looking for a reduction in rent because his income was patchy at best, surviving as he was from trying to dig gold at the local diggings there. So they were hoping that they could halve the rent for a while before they could resume a full rental. So it just gives you sort of that feel of life and times of someone living in 1933 and how difficult it was to actually try and just pay for your own accommodation and that sort of thing. So I thought that was just an interesting view of the transition of the history of that building, but also some quite detailed descriptions of the conditions of the house back there in 1902. I don't think any of us would have liked to live there at that moment. Roads, bridges and railways. I'm not going to give or provide a lot of detail about these, but just to say that, yes, the government was involved in the construction of these things as well. So we have a survey of roads and bridges from 1826, and over time it just becomes more and more defined about the work that the government did for roads and bridges, and the government departments that subsumed that function became bigger and bigger. So Public Works took over looking after roads and bridges in 1856 when it was first put into existence. Railways were a private concern before 1854, but then were transferred to government in 1854. And I think in the early days, Public Works was involved in the construction of railways, but in 1917, all railway construction went to the Department of Railways, and then we see the Ways and Works branch after the railway construction branch take over. We've got Public Works looking after roads. In 1907, a lot of roads came under the control of the relevant local councils, so that happens in 1907, but state roads stay under the control of the government, and in 1925 the Main Roads Board is formed. In 1932 we get the DMR, the Department of Main Roads, and that operates all the way up until 1989 when we finally get the Roads and Traffic Authority. So it just sometimes helps to know who was looking after these things if you're wanting to research that particular aspect. Again, you might think about your construction, your activities that looked after road and bridge construction, railway construction, and so you might go by activity to see what we've got in the catalogue for those particular activities and follow your way to locate records that way. In terms of railway buildings, we do have the permanent way plans and drawings of railway infrastructure. These are 1854 to 1965, and they cover everything from station buildings to station masters' houses to railway lines and bridges, I think. So there's a lot of stuff in these plans, R301. The thing to note about the railway plans is that they're all stored rolled, so they're all rolled up. The conservators need to unroll them and make sure that they're fairly stable before they can be issued in the reading room. So this can take them up to 5 days to sort out for us. So you do need to give 5 days notice if you want to look at one of these permanent way plans and drawings. We also have station cards which look at alterations, additions, etc. to railway stations between 1920 and 1960, and we've got the State Rail Authority photographic reference print collection, so the State Rail photos. This is an example of one of those here. That's Cootamundra Railway Station. Here we've got a glorious plan of the Station Master's house at Mount Victoria. So that's one of those permanent way plans that we just talked about, stored rolled. Bit of sticky tape used there, and you can see there's a bit of damage there on the edges. So fairly fragile, but has been digitised and quite beautiful. And here we see a photograph of the station master at Mount Victoria, not in his house, but with a snowman, in 1962. So a snow day in August 1962 there. We also have photographs, of course, of bridges, and this is just the Gundagai Railway Bridge. No date for this one, but I'm sure a lot of us would be familiar with this bridge. Now, in terms of photographs, so we're getting to the end here. In terms of photographs, we have photos from the Government Printing Office, the Maritime Services Board, State Rail Authority, Government Department of Education. We've also got the Sydney Harbour Bridge branch photograph albums, so special mention to them. And we do have some photographs of public buildings from the Colonial architect as well. So just to give you a flavour of some of the kinds of things that we've got. This photograph here is Department of School Education building at Bridge Street under construction. And our next photo is a photo of them constructing Argyle Cut, and this photograph's from 1912. So I can't quite decide if it was open to the public to inspect or whether these are just people walking through as the building's taking place. But in any case, I just love the clarity of this photograph and just what it shows you of how it looked at the time. This is another photograph of the Argyle Cut from 1914, and we think this must have been taken above. And for us, again, the thing is not so much that they were constructing the cut, but the houses in the background. It's just so amazing to see Sydney as it was, incidental to them taking the photograph of the actual project, which is what they were really recording. Here we have a photograph from the Department of Education. This is Moordun Public School in 1903, so it's very much a slab hut school. I'm not sure if this was the entire school population at the time or not. Records don't reveal. And here we've got a photograph from the Maritime Services Board of a drawing of the old government house and jetty there. So quite beautiful. And here we've got a view from the Maritime Services Board glass negatives of the area in front of the Harbour Master's house on Goat Island. And you can see the original Water Police headquarters there, which was built in 1838. This is obviously after 1932 because we've got the Harbour Bridge in its glory there. So very beautiful. And we've got a wharf under construction at Piermont here. And there's a steam pile driver there on the right. So again, a lot of information visual about how these things were constructed and what it looked like at the time. Here we've got a photograph of the Post Office and Lands Office at Hay. This is from one of the fire commissioners, Mr. L.G. Watt, who took photographs while he was travelling around New South Wales and Victoria, Queensland and South Australia. So they captioned and dated each of their albums, and the photographs are quite tiny. They're not even 4x6, they're smaller. But they give a really good idea of some of these country towns in the late 1920s and early 1930s of regional New South Wales. So something quite fun to look at there. And here we've got the Griffith Court House in 1946. And what I like is the boy riding his bike up the street there. I think that's really cool. And Kenmore Hospital. So this is a photograph of the hospital at Goulburn. I'd say probably in the 20s or 30s maybe. And you can see it must have been folded. It's got the big fold marks there in the middle. So we say if you're looking for photographs particularly, and anything really, be creative with your search term. So you might search by the name of the building or by the locality. You might even search by the agency and then filter the catalogue by digitally available. This image here is the Garden Palace, which burnt down in 1882, and there are a lot of photographs of the Garden Palace, but this one's just a different perspective, which I quite liked. Here we see some photographs that took us quite a deal of time to work out what they were of. So we believe that it's the Darling Harbour Railway Goods Yard, which was at Piermont, and what we could see to help us identify the records was in the photograph in the bottom right-hand corner. There's just a bit of the building behind it on the screen that you might be able to see there. So if you go to this next image, we were able to identify what the behind building was, and that helped us to identify that these photographs were actually the Darling Harbour Railway Goods Yard. So any of you that are familiar with Jennifer Sloggett and some of her work, it was Jenny who identified this for us. And it's quite a delicate and graceful record building that's no longer with us, but it's very beautiful to look at all the same. So what to take away from today? A takeaway that we have a wealth of records to do with government public buildings, I think. To find them, search our catalogue, search by the name of the building, search through the agencies that were involved with that building or the agency that you think might have built the building. Maybe do an activity search to come up with some of the records that we hold in the collection. Don't forget our photographs because they're a wonderful source of information as well as all the paper records and the plans and everything. And finally, if you're looking for a private building, you might want to have a look at our Researching Your House and Property webinar, which looks at some sources that are particularly useful when you're researching private buildings. So thank you for your time today. I hope this has been useful to give you some information about how to go about researching public buildings in the State Archives collection.